Hey everybody, so this week, we're going to be talking about factions in the United States. Primarily the establishment of the first political parties in the United States, the Federalist and the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So let's begin. So, learning objectives for the day, learn about the first political party system, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and also known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. We're going to look at two of the key actors who brought forth this division, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. We're going to interpret two early American elections, the impacts from them, the 1796 and 1800, and then we're going to relate this issues to political polarization over time. We're going to look at how political polarization evolves, and we're going to look at contemporary division very briefly. So let's begin. All right, Federalist Paper 10. This is something we've talked about before. It's important to do a very brief recap on this. The Federalist Papers are the papers written by the Federalist Collective. This was after the Constitutional Convention of 1787. We're debating the ratification of the U.S. Constitution as it was written, and the Federalist Paper. There's a series of up to more than 80 writings that are conveying that the Constitution needs to be ratified as written. Constitution proposed, written by James Madison, and Federalist Paper, once again written by James Madison. This is addressing the issue of pluralism. Every Federalist Paper is addressing a different issue, a different challenge that this new government will face, and they address how this new system will face this new threat. So James Madison writes about the issue of division, the issue that we cannot escape from. Factions are constantly involved in any democratic process, as we see today. So within this text, he says, quote, "The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases which under popular governments have everywhere perished." You see this, he writes very poetically, addressing that this issue of factions, division, is what leads governments everywhere to their perish. So he continues on. Let me skip that quote and read this most important quote from this text. Again, you all have to read this week, so please read this text and engage with it, and I hope you can interpret it further than I'm providing in this lecture. You also have an assignment due this week regarding this text. So, quote, "There are again two methods of removing the cause of factions. The one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence." So destroy the liberty that is essential to factions. Factions originate because we have liberty. We have the right to disagree. So to revisit the quote, "The one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It can never be more truly said than of the first remedy, that it is worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires." So we see them emphasizing that this is a conflict that will always exist in American government. We will always have the issue of factions, and the foundational thing that creates factions is what is also foundational to democracy. And if we get rid of this liberty, we have eroded democracy itself. So liberty, the ability for us to disagree, is what will lead to our demise just as much as it will protect us. So we revisited some of the Federalist Papers. We looked at Federalist Paper 10, what we're going to be reading in class this week. And now let's talk about some of the actors. So we have Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is representing the new political party, the Jeffersonian Republicans, the Democratic Republicans. You can call them whatever you please. History textbooks tend to alternate between the two. Jeffersonian Republicans definitely makes it a lot easier to remember the connection between Thomas Jefferson. But there are 5 unique traits within this party that have a clear contrast within the Federalists, and we want to make sure we understand them clearly because these will be quiz questions. So, Democratic Republicans are one. They are primarily rural. They're from the states, and they're focused on local politics, emphasize localism, local politics. They want states' rights emphasized over federal powers. They were content with the system of government under the Articles of Confederation because it allowed state autonomy within this federal system. And they are fearful of increasing the power of the central government because it could lead to a monarchy. And that actually gets us to our next point. What did they fear? What is the foundational fear within this political party? It is that the last thing we want from government is to become an authoritarian or tyrannical system of government like the ones that we broke away from years prior. There are many texts within the Anti-Federalist Papers, which you read last week, about how blood has been spilt by our brothers, and you want to create a system that mirrors what we escaped from. And so we see that this fear is becoming another empire, becoming like the British monarchy. We also see that in order to ensure that we do not become another British monarchy, we need to have strict interpretations of the Constitution. The Constitution needs to be interpreted exactly as it was written. Now let's look at this again. The Constitution was intended to restrict our federal government. It may seem like an expansion of powers, but it's a specification of what powers are allocated to the federal government and state governments. And they want this strict interpretation to make sure that we are constantly restricting the expansion of power of the federal government. So the Constitution is intended to restrict the federal government, and that's why they want to have a strict interpretation of it. And laissez-faire. We all remember this from high school history classes, but laissez-faire means hands off. They want the government to have no role when it comes to the economy. They want it to be a hands-free, independent economy in which the states can operate their local economies however they desire, whether that be successfully or in failure. So they want these loose connections between the state and the economy. This makes sense. As you see in the southern states, they had slavery, which was, not encouraged in some other regions of the country and globe at the time even. They also saw that they had primarily agricultural economies. Each region within the South had different agriculture they were focused on, a slightly unique economy, and they saw that government intervention could lead to harming certain economies and benefiting others. And we'll go into the contrast opinion in just a second. And then if the U.S. were to have an ally abroad, who should our ally be? Well, the Southern individuals wanted the Revolutionary French to be our ally. You have to think about it at the same time. They are experiencing a revolution. Late 1700s, they're beheading their king. They're creating a new system of government. They're trying to implement a system of democracy, which will have its ebbs and flows throughout history, a lot less consistent than what we see in the U.S. when it comes to the implementation of democracy. But we see that they are right along with us trying to implement this new system of government. So they, if anybody in this country, should be our allies. Sentiment over economic interest. So in contrast, we have the Federalist Party. This is a collective of individuals that were already present prior, but they have formed into a solid political party, and now they have a clear opposing political party instead of just a collective that is advocating against the ratification. That Anti-Federalist collective became the Democratic Republicans. The sentiments merged into that new political party. But now let's look at the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton. Why is Alexander Hamilton even a part of this discussion beyond the play? Because we know he was in the room when it happened and all that jazz. No, we talk about Alexander Hamilton because he was one of the primary authors of the Federalist Papers, where they conveyed the sentiments of this new political party. So Federalist Papers, the Federalist Party. What do they want? They want federalism. They want a strong central government that can unite the independent state governments. And they want unity within these states, but they want an equal exchange between the central and the state governments. They do not want excessive state power that leads to a weak central government like we had previously under the Articles of Confederation, because we remember that moment. What moment? The Shays' Rebellion, in which we revealed the weaknesses of our federal government and the need for a new system of government, and that is the Constitution. That is federalism. That is what the Federalist Party is advocating for, a federal system of government. Now, why do they want this system of government? Well, in opposition to a very autonomous state system, a confederal system of rights. They feared anarchy and mob rule. They thought the worst thing that could happen was loosely interpreting it for easy understanding, is excessive democracy, that people can be so divisive, they can be, you know, they can foster mayhem at times. And if you give individuals and small collectives absolute autonomy, we would end up having mobs uniting against others, and we would have mob rule of majority interest and dismissing of minority interests as well. And anarchy is the worst thing that could happen, according to the Federalists stemming from the North. It is also important that when you think about who the Federalists are, you see that they're primarily urban individuals. They live in the North. They live in concentrated cities. Their economic interests lie in the factories instead of their own farm and properties. So we see that this is a large driver, especially when we look at their economic preferences. But before we do that, let's talk about how they read the Constitution. They believe we need to have loose interpretations of the Constitution. They phrase this as the Constitution is a breathing document. It needs to slightly shift over time, and we need to make sure that the Constitution appeals to the population that is living within the state at the time it is being interpreted. So that's why we need to use our own experiences, our own perspectives, and this strictly written document to loosely interpret how we should regulate the federal government and how we should govern our states when in need. So we also look at protectionism. This is their approach to the economy. What is protectionism? It is that the government must intervene in economic conflict. They must intervene in economic interests. They must intervene with the market. So the government is strongly encouraged within the Federalist Party to engage in infant industries and subsidizing various industries within the U.S. Think of it this way. The U.S. was creating a new economy, a new government. And abroad in Europe, they had textile mills that were operating for generations. How do we compete with a mill that has already been built when we have to take on the cost of building the mill, getting all the raw materials, and getting the employment? Well, the one way to do that is through government subsidies. The government can put some of its money into industries to build up certain industries and make it to where we're competitive on the international stage and then take a step back, which is what actually went out in the time we saw protectionist strategies applied in the infant industries in the northeastern section of the U.S. and early America, which is a large reason why we had the industrialization happen on such a successful rate various periods in our history. And so they need government intervention with the markets. And then we say, when we need an ally abroad, the best ally for the Federalists are the British. They are Anglophiles. You don't necessarily need to remember these terms, but man, does it help. Anglophiles, they want to be allies with the British. Although we just triumphed over such a revolution against these individuals, we need to unite because they are the strongest state globally. They are the best, strategically, the best ally to have because they have the most to offer us. So it is beneficial to align with the British, although we just revolted against them. So we see 5 clear differences between the Democratic Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, and the Federalists, which are Democratic Republicans are rural. They feared monarchy and tyranny. They wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They wanted a laissez-faire engagement with the economy. They wanted the government to have a hands-off approach, and they really wanted to align with the French, if anyone. While the Federalist Paper, the Federalist Party, who we're looking at right here, led by Alexander Hamilton, they wanted a strong central government to unite the multiple states. Federalism. They feared anarchy and mob rule. They feared excessive democracy, which we'll go into later on in this course. They also had a favoritism towards a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They wanted the government to intervene with the economy. They wanted protectionism, and they wanted to align with the British if we had any foreign allies. So let's address some of the supporting casts. We're going to hear a little bit about John Adams throughout this course, although we already have Judicial Johnny, represented the British soldiers in court after the Boston Massacre. But beyond this, he is one of the leading Federalists. We see a lot of sentiments and discussions between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. A neat fact, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson led the executive branch together. John Adams was our second president, and his vice president was the opposing party representative Thomas Jefferson, which we will go into in just a little bit. And they, because of John Adams, we have a lot of fair court procedures in addition to true peaceful transition of power, even when opposing parties are transitioning power. And in addition to this, we saw that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were lifelong friends, although at various times, especially when they were transitioning power, they became stark enemies, writing negatively about each other in various publications. And then we see later on in life, they rekindled that friendship. And a fascinating tidbit in American history, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day. John Adams, his famous last words were Jefferson lives on, and 2 hours later, Jefferson took his final breath. Another fascinating detail about that day was July 4th. So we see that two of our greatest founding fathers, the last two from our whole entire collective of founding fathers to take their final breaths, were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, representatives of opposing political parties who became close friends and allies, who died on the same day speaking peaceful words about each other. That's amazing. That's kind of fascinating. So John Adams was also George Washington's vice president. We'll go into more detail in just another slide or two. We look at the other side, supporting cast. We see James Madison, the individual who feared political parties yet acted to create one of the first political parties. He is a Jeffersonian Republican, Democratic Republican. He helped write the Federalist Papers with Hamilton. I know, those were the papers with the title Federalist Papers. Well, that was when it was Federalist and Anti-Federalist. After this divide mitigated, he aligned with the Democratic Republicans. He worked adamantly to introduce bicameralism and checks and balances within the United States. We see a lot of his Federalist Papers were some of the most profoundly written texts we have ever had in American history, to the point where they are some of the ideal texts regarding American political theory. He was Jefferson's Secretary of State and later on became the 4th U.S. president. Now I'm going to sip my coffee. So how did this division establish the first political party system in the U.S.? Well, we'll talk about how in the next slides, but why? What makes them the first two political parties? We have 3 reasons, and it's important to remember these 3 on our quiz. So first, they established the precedent that representatives will campaign for the office of president through their party. Prior to this, the implementation of these 2 political parties, and this did come with a little delay, we did not have 2 camps advocating for a single individual to gain the office of president. Instead, we had multiple individuals with all unique interests, and we voted among them, and we'll talk about that in just a slide. So we did not have campaigning for the office of the president prior, but these 2 political parties implemented that campaigning. Second, partisanship finally entered the executive branch. We finally see a president with John Adams that aligns with the political party. Remember, George Washington, with his famous farewell address, expressed a clear disdain for political parties. And now he has left office, and we have a president, John Adams, who aligns with the Federalist Party. So the executive branch is now a partisan office. And third, both collectives have consistent policy agendas. They are now 2 organized collectives. We have cross-cutting interest aligning within the 2 contrasting collectives. So we see the Federalists are aligning with all 5 of those points I made prior: their identity, their fears, their economic preferences, their interpretation of the Constitution, their foreign allies. And the Anti-Federalists, and the Jeffersonian Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, have aligned in opposition along the same 5 issues. So we see these issues aligning within the 2 political parties, 2 clear camps with 2 clearly different approaches to governance. So it is important to remember these 3 reasons why these are political parties. And you can rephrase them, but remember there's now campaigning for the president. The executive branch, the president, is now a partisan post, which will never be backtracked. And then third, we have consistent policy agendas within the 2 parties. So let's talk about one of the most interesting elections in U.S. history, the election of 1796. So there were two precedents set. First is we have two-term limits. That was a precedent set by George Washington as he stepped down faithfully. And we saw this challenge later on in U.S. history, but we will talk about that again probably during elections and campaigns, which is, I think, week 10. I don't know. We'll talk about that a later week. And then we have campaigning for the presidency. We have partisan campaigning for the presidency for the first time. But that's not the only true takeaway from this election. Those are two of the precedents that were set. But we also had issues with this election that led to the implementation of the 12th Amendment. What were these issues beyond the fact that only 7 of the states allowed popular vote and only 2% of the population voted? I want to reiterate that. 2% of the U.S. population voted in the first presidential election after George Washington. This is when there was a debate for who should be president, and only 2% had access to our government, a percentage that we have expanded immensely today. But we see, and that's a large reason why you see emphases on how we had a republic instead of a democracy. That is a lecture for another day. We have a representative democracy, which could be the definition for a republic in many senses, but we'll talk about that later on. And if you have questions about that, please email me. I'm happy to help give you more information to help build up your essays. But we also see that the time we elected, I'm sorry, let me restart that. We need the 12th Amendment after this election. Why? Because the way this election was done was flawed. And this was the way we intended for every election to go from here on out. In this election, we had a handful of individuals. We did not have 2 candidates, and we did not just have one office. We had numerous candidates campaigning for 2 different offices. The winner of the election will become the U.S. president, but they do not have a running mate. The runner-up in this election will become the vice president. This was an idea that I thought I was revolutionary for having when I was a freshman in college. And I thought, what if, I know I probably shouldn't have known this by then, but what if we just had, the second place be the vice president? So we had them work together. Well, this was a flawed system because once John Adams won the presidency, the runner-up was Thomas Jefferson, the representative for the opposing political party, and they had to govern the executive branch together. Well, John Adams did everything in his power at this time period to minimize the influence of the vice presidency. So we see the vice presidency becoming a very non-influential role during this time period, silencing of that individual in government, and we just see conflict within the single executive branch. We do not need checks on our own branch of government. We need checks from other branches. The legislative, the judicial should be checking the executive, not the executive itself. So this identified a flaw. We need to change how we elect the U.S. president, and that is what the 12th Amendment did. We'll talk about that in just a second. And we have another election just a few years later, the election of 1800. This is where we had another flaw in our governing system. We still have yet to implement or create this 12th Amendment. So we are still using the outdated, non-ideal system of elections that was present in 1796. But we have not yet identified how outdated and flawed it is. Well, in this election, we saw one of those flaws as we tied for our vote for presidency 35 times. It was the 36th vote when we finally had somebody win out and we had a new president appointed to the office. In this election, we saw that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the one who shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. We'll talk about that later on. If you haven't known, didn't hear the play, where the room where it happened and all that jazz, Aaron Burr did shoot Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Fascinating history. So let's backtrack a bit. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied 35 times, and we could not figure out who to elect to be our new president. Well, we also remember John Adams was the president at the time. His vice president was Thomas Jefferson. Now, when we were tied for determining who our president should be 35 times, we had a state of electoral emergency. Now, John Adams could have chose to call an emergency powers and expand his presidency and go beyond the 4 years he was elected. But instead, he chose to remain silent, although he had lost the election hands down due to some conflicts that we'll talk about later. Well, I don't think we will actually cover the XYZ affair, but and the Alien and Seditions Act that significantly harmed John Adams' view within the public realm. But he had a successful presidency, and we see that his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, is tied for the presidency. Well, on this 36th ballot, we finally determined that Thomas Jefferson will be the new president. And guess what? The runner-up, Aaron Burr, will be his vice president. And what is one of the main takeaways from this election? We have the first peaceful transition of power between opposing political parties. This was a time where in France we had beheadings of kings, when we had revolutions, when we had shifts in regimes. So the fact that we were able to shake hands and have a peaceful transition of power from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, two representatives of opposing political parties, although they did just share the office, they shared it in conflict. We see them for the first time peacefully transitioning power, a precedent that is to be set and maintained throughout the rest of U.S. history, and hopefully contained for the rest of our history to continue. So, recap, 1800 election, we finally have the incentives to create the 12th Amendment, which we will do right after this election. We have two dominating political parties firmly established, as they have truly begun campaigning for president over these handful of election periods. And then we have a peaceful transition of power between political parties. And let's look at the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment changed the way we elect the president and the vice president. Previously, the president was the one who had the most votes, and the vice president was the runner-up. We cannot have that system, because if we had that system today, think about it. How successful would a Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump presidency be? How successful would a Joe Biden and Donald Trump presidency be? How successful do you think a Kamala and Donald presidency would be? We see that this is a flawed system that sounds good in sentiment, but once applied, we see the silencing of a vice presidency and an executive branch that does not work optimally. So we also see that there are some other details. We look at how this amendment reads. There's far more than just changing how we elect the president, but that's going to be the focus today, and we will re-examine the 12th Amendment later on. But, quote, the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president. They shall name in their ballot the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots, the person voted for as vice president. So we will vote for two separate offices instead of voting for one and then having the runner-up go to the other. So this determined how we vote for the president and the vice president. And then it also determined that if there was a tie within the Electoral College, there was a tie when voting, when the electors meet. The Electoral College is a loose term, not necessarily used at the time, but they did say when the electors meet, and this acted as, in a sense, an electoral college, with half of the states not having access to popular vote, while some actually did. But we see the House of Representatives votes for the president if there's a tie within the Electoral College. A new rule: if there's a tie, the House of Representatives steps in and acts as the tie-breaking vote. This we will see only happen once in U.S. history, in the election of 1826, when John Quincy Adams becomes our U.S. president, the son of John Adams. But that's a different discussion for another day. And so let's talk about political polarization after I drink my coffee. It's getting cold. I take too long. So, do we view our political system or our political opponents as legitimate or rational? This slide works a lot better when I do this in person and you can engage with me, but ask yourself these questions. Does exposure to opposition lead to lower levels of polarization between parties? And to be clear, polarization is the division that occurs between the two dominating political parties in the United States as they move away from their moderate middle towards their more extreme polar ends. And this is something that we see occurring in contemporary politics. Now, what happens? What is a key thing we need in government, in a pluralist system of government, we need bipartisanship. What is bipartisanship? Bipartisanship is the agreement between two opposing political parties. It is the opposite of political polarization. We want bipartisanship. Now, bipartisanship, by the way, has decreased roughly 30% since 1989. So we are witnessing a heightened period of partisanship and a lack of bipartisanship, something that might be asked very briefly on a quiz. And as you think and you see here on this slide, please ask yourself these two questions and ask yourself how we can get to a place where we can improve the answers we give to these two questions. So I want to emphasize this will not be on a quiz, but I think it's important to understand the general picture of division in the United States and how it's not just a rapid thing that has impacted the US suddenly, but something we have engaged with throughout our entire history. We think about the founding era when there was division regarding the ratification of the Constitution, and then division right thereafter regarding the size and impact of our federal government. What is the issue? What is the relationship between states and the federal government going to be in the United States? And then we see after we got through this area of conflict, while not addressing the conflicts but living through them, we see the period of civil war and the Reconstruction era. This is when the issue of slavery and the difference between the southern and northern economies really catapulted to create a conflict and a civil war, as we know throughout history. We also see, if you look at the Civil War through various very niche history textbooks, you can look at Civil War and its impacts in, northern Mississippi. When you look at those texts, you see a lot of the conflict was regional conflicts, and they used the greater divide behind the Civil War to mobilize on these conflicts. But we do see, when we look at the national level of conflict, the Civil War and Reconstruction era, people were divided over the economy and the impact that slavery had on that economy. We see, after we've addressed the Civil War and reunited through the Reconstruction era, the early 20th century era, where we were divided over economic policies, labor rights. Think about early 1900s. This is where we were once again debating the expansion of power with our federal government. In the 1930s, right at the end of this period, we saw an extreme expansion of our federal government through the New Deal and other policies of the time. We also see the Civil Rights era, 1950s, 1970s. This is where we saw the most recent political realignment, which we'll talk about on the next slide. This is where the nation was divided over segregation and various other social issues, the rights of minority groups within the nation. As they were going through a period of expansion, many were fearful and hoping to restrict those expanding rights in the Civil Rights era. Conflicts, once again, that we still deal with to this very day, as we see conflicts among the Black Lives Matter movement and various other minority rights collectives. We also see the modern era. This is today, 2000s to present. We're divided along ideological and partisan lines. We're focused on liberal and conservative, Democrat, Republican. This is evident in numerous political institutions. Think about the media, have the partisan lens you get to see. Interest groups, they only advocate for on one side of the political aisle. Political parties operate in very partisan manners. And we see numerous points. We don't need to go into too much detail to be able to understand how divided the modern era is. But we do want to make sure that we know that our history is a history of conflict and class conflict within the United States. Majorities against minorities and minorities against majorities. This will never dissipate, but will shift in many ways, and we can mitigate the harms that come from political polarization throughout our history by addressing the concerns of the opposing side of the aisle. Now, how have political parties evolved over the years? We see party realignment is a key term that I just mentioned a second ago. The great party realignment of the Civil Rights era. And that was when a large amount of Democrats who from the South were identifying with the Democratic Party, who were pro-segregationists, after a couple things we'll talk about once again during the elections period, as we saw a individual come into the political realm as a third-party candidate who pulled a lot of the Democrats out of the Democratic Party, the Southern Dixiecrats, as history books refer to them, and realigned them with a third party. And then after that party dissipated and the succeeding election, we see them align with the Republican Party along the issue of segregation. Now, these partisan lines do not exist anymore. We are not divided over the issue of segregation and desegregation, but instead the party alignment that occurred at that time period has persisted today, as there has not been a single issue dividing the two collectives and creating a shift of a large collective of individuals within one party to leave and align with the other, which is what party realignment is. So, a definition for party realignment is when a substantial amount of voters switches party allegiances and produces long-term changes in the political landscape. Democrats leaving the Democratic Party and joining the Republican Party. So, long-term changes because a substantial amount of voters switched political parties. Party de-alignment is, well, if you think it through, it's when a substantial amount of voters do not identify with any of the primary parties. They leave the primary parties in large numbers. This is often a prerequisite to party realignment and often results in a realignment. But a de-alignment is when they have not aligned with the opposing party at the same pace. And party identification is what we're talking about. It's one's alignment with a political party. When I ask you who you are in the political realm, there is a high chance that somebody's answer might be a Democrat, a Republican, a liberal, a conservative, a libertarian, whatever it may be. This is your party identification. And we see, if you look at some of the, I actually believe we do not have this reading, but if you research Pew Research Center and you just look at ideology, we see that there is a rising number of people who identify as independents. And I want you once again to ask yourself, does this signal a realignment of political parties? I don't know. Maybe you could write a paper about it. There's a paper topic opportunity. But let's keep going. So, what did we learn? Some weeks I'll go through these with you, some weeks I won't. This week I'm not because I rambled on a bit today. But if you have any questions, email me. I'll talk to you on the phone. I will text you back and forth. I'll email you back and forth about the content. Whatever you want to talk about, let's talk about it. Let's make sure you have a firm understanding of these concepts, but make sure you can answer these 5 questions confidently by the time we take our upcoming quiz. And here are the answers to those 5 questions. So let's look. We have our number 1 assignment due today. I know we had our essay topic assignment, but that was so brief I wouldn't even call it a true assignment. We have our first true assignment due this week. Submit your Federalist Paper 10 worksheet. We have the start of a new discussion post this week, so make sure you revisit the discussion post success document. That is in your introduction tab in your contents page. So I have an introduction tab with additional resources. That's where I have your essay topic selection paper. That's where I have a worksheet breakdown for every one of the assignments in this course. This is an important place for resources for you, so please make sure you revisit that and make sure you know how to succeed within the discussion post, because this is the week where I start grading a bit harsher regarding the discussions. So please go through your readings. Federalist Paper 10 is the most important document you will read in this course. I think it's one of the best well-written ones. So please engage with it. Please make sure you do the assignment that's connected to it. You listen to the lecture, you go through all the readings, and you engage with the discussion post, and you'll be good. It's all these things move a lot faster than you'd imagine when you hear about them compared to when you're actually doing them. So you got this. Reach out for anything. I'm happy to help, but I won't know what you need unless you communicate it to me. So communication is key, and I'm here for you. So reach out, and I'm happy to give you all of my time. All right, y'all, thank you for another good week. Let's do this again next week.